Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining me now from Havana is Carlos Alzugaray. He is a former Cuban diplomat and educator. With me here in the studio is Philip Brenner. He's an expert in U.S.-Cuba relations and a professor at American University. Joining us from Miami is Cuban-American entrepreneur Hugo Cancio. He was born in Cuba and does business there. Also with us in the studio is James Early. He has visited Cuba more than 50 times and is an advocate for better U.S.-Cuba relations. Welcome to all of you to the studio. Ambassador Alzugaray, let me start with you. So Cuba has marked the 60th anniversary of the revolution, and as we just saw in that report, the former president, Raul Castro, marked the event with a speech, and in that speech he warned that the United States seems to be taking the path of confrontation with Cuba. How would you assess the current relationship?
Well, the current relations are really very bad, although I must say, although President Trump has said that he reversed everything, he hasn't. In fact, the embassies at least remain in name. There is a considerable reduction of the embassies, but they're still here. They're still here. We are still there. The Cuban embassy in Washington remains there. We have a full-fledged ambassador in Washington. They have in charge of affairs here. The exchanges in the security sphere continue. There is a number of exchanges on counter-narcotics, law enforcement. For example, recently, Cuba returned several fugitives demanded by Interpol Washington. The travel continues. It has been reduced more by the so-called acoustic incidents than by any new regulations. Right now, as I was coming here, there is a cruise ship in Havana Harbor full of passengers, probably a lot of them coming from the United States. So things have not turned to absolutely zero. What is difficult about this is that the embassy connection has been reduced a lot. For example, consular affairs are not working. People, Cubans who want to travel to the United States cannot do it. So this hurts really the regular Cuban people, the normal Cuban. The Cuban government is very clear in its position. They're not going to accept any pressure, and they're not going to make any concession that has to do with Cuban sovereignty. So we are back, in that sense, we are back to where we were, let's say, before President Obama, or even a little bit before of that. But we have new conditions because the two governments are talking to each other, at least at the level of mid-level security officials, mid-level health officials,
right,
mid-level law enforcement officials. So this is where we are.
Philip Brenner, as we just heard there are still links between the United States and Cuba, but the tone has changed, hasn't it? The rhetoric has got a bit harsher. We heard John Bolton there talk about a troika of tyranny, the other two countries in that troika being Venezuela and Nicaragua. What is your view of what's happening right now?
Well, I agree very much with what Ambassador Alzugaray said. I think that the problem largely was not the intention of the Trump administration to make things as worse. He was playing to his base and using rhetoric, and then he only rolled back two small items to make travel a little more difficult. What came about was that Marco Rubio, Senator Rubio from Florida, got a hold of information that there were some illnesses among U.S. personnel in the embassy, and he blew this up. And in response, President Trump felt he had to do something. And these incidents are largely manufactured. They claim as 26 Americans have been ill, and there is some evidence that there were 26 people who claim to be ill. Some of these are psychosomatic, people who imagine illness. There were 4 people who had some long-term illnesses, but these was spread out over a 9-month period, and there's no evidence that these came from any kind of attack. They easily could have come from something these people ingested, and that wasn't investigated.
There have been some reports very recently, Philip, which tells us that those so-called sonic attacks were actually insects, crickets making noises. Somebody recorded them, and they analyzed them, and it's a cricket that is particular, it's indigenous to Cuba.
That's exactly right. I mean, in fact, the original finding was by the CIA, those recordings couldn't have been made by crickets, but then it turned out that the person who made the recording said that he was recording crickets.
Right.
So yes, I mean, it's clear that there wasn't an acoustic attack. There were some people who were ill, but people get ill all the time.
All right, let me bring in Hugo Cancio. Hugo, you're an entrepreneur, a businessman who does business with Cuba. You're also in touch with many young Cubans. There are many people, of course, who are opposed to these contacts between the United States and Cuba, Cubans who are opposed to it. But what is your feeling about younger Cubans? Do they want to see relations improve?
Well, of course, the majority of the Cuban people and the Cuban diaspora and Cubans living abroad, they want to engage with their native country. They want to go back, establish businesses, and the Cuban government has improved tremendously in the way in which they engage with their Cubans diaspora. We were recently part of the whole process to participate in the comments made to the revision of the new constitution that is about to be approved in a couple of weeks. Cubans living abroad were able to participate. So as Cuba, as the United States, well, I don't want to say the United States government. I want to say that the U.S. Cuba policy right now is in the hands of a few members of the U.S. government, Senator Marco Rubio, Mr. Bolton, that they have kidnapped this policy of change and transformation and engagement with the Cuban people. In the process, they're hurting 11 million Cubans in the island and the Cuban diaspora that wants to engage with this country, that wants to be reunited with this family, that wants to continue the dialogue with the Cuban government to earn more space for us to participate in the prosperity and future of our country.
James, earlier, of course, there was a lot of optimism a few years ago when President Obama made that announcement that he was going to open up to Cuba, restore diplomatic relations. If you look at that time and you look at today, has much of what former President Obama did been undermined?
Well, first of all, it wasn't President Obama by himself. It was a bilateral relation between he and President Raul Castro. And I would agree with Philip Brenner that much of what Raul Castro and President Obama were able to establish has been maintained. However, a dangerous rhetoric has increased, and I think Raul Castro, who's head of the Communist Party, the general of the army, when he noted that they would be prepared to resist, this is not just a question of Cuba and the U.S. John Bolton has targeted the so-called Troika. Venezuela is under economic and media attack and threats of regime change, blatantly, vulgarly stated by representatives of the United States government. In that same speech, Raul Castro referred to the situation in Nicaragua, the intensified attacks on Nicaragua by the United States, and the attacks on Venezuela. And he suggested that the United States needs to be very cautious here because they could start a big conflagration, not just between Cuba and the U.S., but he was really talking about Latin America, the dangerous mixture of what is going on with the right-wing fascists in Brazil, who have aligned themselves. Bolsonaro, the new president, has aligned himself with Donald Trump, expelled thousands of Cuban doctors. The government in Colombia and where murderous attacks are going on every day against trade unionists and Afro-descendants. So he's looking at the region, and I think it's important for the audience to recognize when we talk about bilateral relations, they are always situated in multilateral relations, and that this is much of what Raul Castro is talking about. He also stated that they will not break their ties with Venezuela in that same speech, and so this is the broader context. And I would say the rhetoric has intensified, and the mercurial circumstance of this really crazed foreign policy, a lack of a focused foreign policy, anything could happen. But I think substantively the relationship is basically where it was. And then looking inside Cuba, Cuba is going about its own internal mediations, its own internal debates within its party, within its government, between its citizens, making its own adjustments, not in direct response to the United States, as the United States certainly has had some leverage on that. So that's a broader context, I think, in which to look at the statement by Raul Castro.
Ambassador Alzugaray, when you hear this kind of language that comes out of the Trump administration, the kind of rhetoric that we hear, how is that being received in Cuba?
Well, I think the Cuban government has reacted in a firm vigorous way, but not exaggerating. Cuba has not engaged in that same rhetoric that is going on the American side. And I think that's a very smart position because Cuba wants to have the door open to continue the process that was begun with President Obama. But let me say this. Sometimes I wonder if the Bolton speech in Miami had really an international purpose or was more focused, however wrongly, on the domestic issue. He went to Miami shortly before the midterm elections, obviously to stimulate the base. But the problem with that base, with that Cuban-American base, is that it is not as large as it was before. It's a divided community with a part of the community not supporting that kind of speech, and it is not the decisive factor. There was a time when hardline on Cuba was an insurance policy in Florida. That is not happening anymore. For example, 2 Cuban Americans lost elections. So this is important. On the other hand, you know, all these Armageddon kind of speech is kind of laughable. President Maduro was inaugurated yesterday. Nothing happened. There were predictions that the army would overthrow him. All these predictions coming from Miami and from the Venezuelan opposition. Nothing like that is happening. Maduro is strong, he's empowered, he has the support of the army, he has the support of the people. So, and Cuba, and has the support of Cuba, obviously. So I say that Bolton's words, Trump's words, Rubio's words, they are dangerous. I'm not saying that they're not dangerous, but that they are, there's more bark than bite to those speeches.
Philip Brenner, you know, as we heard, there are still links between the United States and Cuba, but the most important thing, the embargo, is still in place. Cuba calls it the blockade. This is something that was born out of the Cold War era, wasn't it? I mean, has it lost its effect right now?
Well, the embargo was created fully in 1962. Congress gave the president the authority to issue embargo orders, and the president in 1962 began to issue those. They were increased in 1964. The clear intent was to overthrow the Cuban government. It didn't work. But in 1996, those executive orders became locked into law under something called the Helms-Burton Act. And that codified all of the executive orders and made it more difficult now to remove the embargo, so that a president can't simply take away the embargo. There are ways of relaxing it by reading around the law, but basically President Obama was unable to relax the embargo legally. It takes an act of Congress, and it doesn't look like this Congress is willing to do that.
Philip, you've just been in Cuba. You got back recently, right? A few weeks ago. You talked to a lot of people there. What were you hearing?
So I want to put part of what James Early said and part of what Ambassador Alzugaray said into some context. I do think that there's a total lack of reality on the part of the United States. First, in the sense that there is a regional context, and the United States is trying to reestablish the Monroe Doctrine in all of Latin America, and it's not going to work. Latin Americans don't want it, Cubans don't want that. And they're trying to impose their will in Cuba this way. The second aspect of that is that Cubans are changing their society. President Trump acts as if there is a deadness there that's not. It was a vibrancy that I hadn't seen in a long time as they're creating a new constitution. There were thousands and thousands of meetings where people came to meetings to discuss the original draft, and I've looked at the changes in the draft, and 80% of the original document was changed, made, in fact, providing stronger rights for individuals. So it's a very dynamic society right now.
Hugo Cancio, on the business side, has anything changed with this tougher line being taken by the Trump White House?
No, not really. Obviously, a lot of American companies that had initiated contact with the Cuban authorities to begin the process of engaging with business activities in Cuba Obviously, that has slowed down a little bit. There's some kind of tiredness in the hearts and minds of the CEOs of companies that wanted to do business in Cuba, just because of the rhetoric going around and a lot of people being concerned about being singled out by either Bolton or Senator Rubio, and so forth and so on. But however, the cruise lines continue to go to Cuba. The Cuban government continues to authorize new companies in the cruise line industry to engage and go to Cuba. As Ambassador Alzugaray said, there was a cruise ship in Havana today, I believe it was a Norwegian Sky, that arrived in Havana with 2,700 passengers, and that is going to increase. So yeah, there's been a slowdown on in ways of engagement with the Cubans, but other companies will continue now to go back to Cuba to continue the negotiation and the conversation in hopes that this political environment that we're suffering right now will change in the near future. Going back to the embargo real quick, we could go back and forth the historical facts of why the embargo was put in place. The fact is that the embargo right now is an inhumane policy that affects the Cuban people more than affects anybody else. And the fact that the U.S. government, some members of Congress are still using that as a tool to bring about change in Cuba, by force, I think is inhumane, and I think it's absurd. And Cuba continues to open up. Cuba continues to engage with the citizens. The constitutional process that is going on now. Cuba continues to engage with normalizing their relationship with the diaspora, and that is encouraging. And the U.S. government should take that into consideration. And we should have to find a way to take out of the hands of Senator Marco Rubio and Mr. Bolton U.S. Cuba policy and try to stimulate both government to continue the dialogue and move forward into a new direction.
James Early, when the Cuban president, the relatively new Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, when he sits down with his advisors, when they meet, how high up the list of challenges would be the relationship with the United States?
It would be very high because the United States has proven to be a very dangerous adversary, having a CIA invasion in 1962 with, I think, 1,400 soldiers, having coddled terrorists who walk around Miami, who bombed hotels and the like. So, but the Cubans are mostly concerned about their own internal dynamic, their own internal development. I had an opportunity to sit for almost 3 hours with the new president 6 months before he became president, principally to talk about issues of race, but to observe him. He's a very meticulous man, and despite what people say that, and he has said it, that ultimately it is the head of the Communist Party, Raul Castro, who will be the validator of major decisions, but he did not say he would be the initiator of those major decisions. Raul Castro acknowledged in his anniversary speech that he and his generation were very happy and very satisfied with this new generation of leadership and what they were doing. So there is an independence here in the context of the way that the Cuban system is set up, of the Communist Party, of the elected government officials, and what they call a proactive citizenry, not just a citizenry who votes, but as Philip Brenner pointed out, there were thousands of meetings, of consultations, and as our Cuban American here has pointed out, the Cubans in the diaspora participated in that constitutional process. That's a rather unprecedented form of democratic engagement, if you look at demos as the citizen actualizing himself. The principal concern of the new president, however, is taking on leadership of the government, to say that you must be more responsive to the citizens. You must go out and meet with the citizen. You must be patient. And saying to the Communist Party in those consultations, you are not to engage directly in those consultations. You are to listen to what the ordinary citizen is saying. So again, that's the broader context in which the governance is unfolding. And there will be collective leadership there emphasizing. And I think that's a reference to the singularity of Fidel Castro, of the huge 20th century figure that he was.
Okay, Ambassador Alzugaray, of course, we've been talking about change in Cuba, that referendum taking place next month on the Constitution, but what kinds of change are we talking about here?
Well, the change basically, we're talking about first economic change, which, to be very frank, has been delayed more than it should be. But the Cuban government has prioritized over the last year. If you look at 2018, so many political changes. A new constitution was proposed. Public space was broadened by the introduction of internet and cell phones, and by this, what my colleague said. And I would bet that once the constitution is approved next month, the government of Diaz-Canel will be free to address the economic issues. And that's what they're going to do. That from everything they said at the last session of the National Assembly, they're going to address the pending economic reform. Now, that is important. But let me add something to the external context, which sometimes it's overlooked in the United States. Cuba is enjoying a honeymoon with China, Russia, and the European Union. Recently, the president of Spain was here. So these three powers, which are the, let's say, the second tier of powers in the world after the United States, are very eager and very ready to continue engaging with Cuba, and that is going to help Cuba economically. If Cuba does what it has to do, which has to accelerate the process of reform, and the Cuban economy starts to react, and this they can do now because they feel they are consolidated. When the Constitution is approved, the new leadership, the new generation is going to feel consolidated, and that will allow them to work the economy in a way that they have not worked it until now. So I would bet that next year is going to be good in that sense. Yeah. Consolidation of the political changes introduced in 2018 and the beginning of the breakout of the Cuban economy.
All right, Philip, there already have been some changes, haven't there? The government introduced a draft law recently banning ownership of private property, and there was resistance from the public. They were asked for their opinions on that. The public said, no, that's not acceptable to us, and there was a compromise.
Yes, in fact, what was most interesting about this is not only that there was a reaction to the laws, the regulations in July that the government pulled back on. This was about limiting the ownership, not ending private property, but limiting the ownership, for example, the number of restaurants someone could own. But the Catholic Church and the evangelical churches became very involved in the discussion of the Constitution, and they were successful in getting it changed to remove the right to have same-sex marriage. Now that's a sea change, to have a non-governmental organization lobbying on behalf of a particular political position and having it succeed. That opens a whole new possibility.
Hugo Cancio, these changes that Philip have been telling us about here, how significant are they for Cuba and Cuban business?
Look, I think they're extremely significant. As Ambassador Alzugaray was saying, the Cuban government, with this constitutional reform that they're about to approve in a couple of weeks, are setting up the stage for more economic openings and more economic opportunities. Those economic openings and opportunity had to be, in some kind of way, be part of a constitutional process and a consultation with the Cuban people, which included, by the way, again, I'd like to repeat it, included the diaspora for the first time in history, and at least in the history of the 60 years of the revolutionary process. Okay. So I think this is a great beginning. I agree with Ambassador Alzugaray. All right. This coming 12th month and the next year.
All right, I'm going to have to leave it there. Hugo, we have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us.
Well, thank you.
That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for being with us.